Cemeteries are eerie places. It makes no difference how old they are. There's something unsettling about seeing dead bodies and ghostly gravestones. Of course, the United States is a relatively young country. Graveyards in Europe and Asia are frequently centuries older than those in the United States. The stories of the people buried on such sites are nearly as old as the sites themselves. Generations of people have been told tales about their purported ghosts. Although the US doesn't quite have the same amount of history, it does have its own lengthy past. Additionally, the adjacent cemeteries are interesting. The tales they have discovered are amazing and terrifying. You are watching the Quick List. Hit the like and subscribe button now to get more videos like this. Learn about 10 of America's oldest cemeteries in this list, along with the purported ghosts that are said to reside there. These old cemeteries are quite eerie. 10. Old Gravesend Cemetery in New York. The history of New York City is quite old. Additionally, it serves as a business and travel hub in the modern day. Therefore, it wouldn't be incorrect to assume that much of the old Big Apple has been restored and covered in pavement. But not everything in New York City is progressing. In reality, there are numerous historic cemeteries dotted throughout its boroughs. In cemeteries that date back to the 17th century are the first Dutch settlers of the city. One of the oldest of those is in Brooklyn, in Old Gravesend Cemetery. It was first settled in the vicinity in 1643. Old Gravesend was first mentioned in a will written in 1658. Therefore, although the cemetery's exact founding date is unknown, it most likely occurred around the 1640s. The cemetery has 379 gravestones in all. The stones have been being renovated by city officials. The cost of maintenance is high, but the history it brings is priceless. The most well-known occupant of the cemetery is, likely, Lady Deborah Moody. She was the original settler and originator of the neighborhood. In all of New England, she was the first woman to found a settlement of Dutch immigrants. Moody, who was well off throughout her life, first moved from Holland to Massachusetts. But when she arrived, she ran afoul of the Puritans. They disapproved of her acceptance of adult baptism. Additionally, her efforts to convert others were seen as impolite. She left after being expelled and made her way to New York. At the time, the region was called New Amsterdam, and a large portion of its residents were Dutch. Moody settled in Brooklyn's contemporary Gravesend neighborhood and blended in seamlessly. However, despite her notoriety at the time, it is unknown if Moody is buried at the cemetery in her chosen city. Although it is likely, historians lack concrete evidence that she was interred there. It's conceivable that the riddle will never be resolved given the age of the burial cemetery. 9. Granary Burying Ground in Boston. Similar to New York City, Boston's commotion never stops. And like New York City, Boston has a fascinating past of its own. Old graves abound in the Massachusetts city, as they do elsewhere along the eastern seaboard. Granary Burying Ground is one of the oldest in Boston. The cemetery site existed for about a century before that name was formally given in 1737. Until the 1880s, famous Bostonians were interred in the granary ground for more than 200 years. Approximately 5,000 persons were interred there in all. Not all the burial markers have lasted the test of time, though. Officials currently believe that 2,300 stones still need to be in place. In the 1800s, the headstone's disorganized past took an intriguing turn. Bostonians were upset with the disarray of the grounds in the middle of that century. So they began a multi-year project to order and correct thousands of grave markers. Some were shifted and lost. The cleanup unintentionally ruined some of them. The location is much more organized now. It's not apparent whether each headstone is genuinely at its original location, though. The Granary Burying Ground nevertheless continues to play the hits. Paths inside the cemetery take scores of visitors on an extraordinary trip. In the cemetery lie the remains of Crispus Attucks, John Hancock, Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. The Granary Burying Ground is where American history is actually interred. 8. The Ernest With Site in Texas. Historic cemeteries can be found in New York and Boston, but there are many other old graveyards throughout America. In reality, there are cemeteries all around the United States that are much older. Texas, of all places, is home to the oldest of them all. An old Brazos River burial site was discovered by historians in the 1970s. It is now referred to as the Ernest Witt site. The land may have first served as a cemetery about 5,000 years ago, according to archaeological data. Scientists believe the latest burials there happened about AD 1500. These fossils were sometimes buried using simple stone tools. Animal skulls, carved stone knives, and shell jewelry were found in more recent graves. The location is currently a gold mine of archaeological knowledge regarding pre-contact life in America. The history of the burial site's name is an intriguing one in and of itself. In the 1930s, Ernest Witt was a small child growing up in a rural area of Texas. Witt and his brother were out scrounging one day during the Great Depression near the Brazos River. They unintentionally discovered some fossils. They continued excavating despite not knowing what they had unearthed. They discovered more old items gradually but surely. The strange part, though, is that the brothers kept it a secret from everyone. Ernest maintained the location a secret for many years. He finally contacted the Texas Archaeological Survey in 1974. Scientists flocked to the location in shock and started digging. Since then, they have discovered the remains of about 250 people there. The historical significance is enormous. However, it was almost lost to time forever. 7. Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. There is an old burial ground in West Virginia. Near the Ohio border, in the state's far north, is the Grave Creek Mound. It has the name of the nearby town of Moundsville. If you hadn't guessed it by now, the burial site is a single large mound. However, there is more to it than that. The graves inside, according to archaeologists, date to around 250 BC. They are the resting places of local Adena tribe individuals. The Adena buried their deceased in these elevated mounds back when their civilization was booming. The Grave Creek Mound is breathtaking in its sheer enormity. According to scientists, the hill was formed by the tribe moving close to 57,000 tons of soil. Additionally, the Adena constructed smaller mounds that were placed close to the substantial earthen dome. In those, they placed meaningful trinkets and memories, like jewelry and religious things. The location served as their solemn memorial for many years. Sadly, thieves arrived at Grave Creek Mound prior to archaeologists. Many elements of the soil structure have been preserved by science, but many more have been lost to time. The smaller mounds were looted by looters in the 18th and 19th centuries. They removed souvenirs, seashells, ivory beads, copper bracelets, and other items that had been left untouched for many years. Thank goodness, some things survived. Additionally, the mound strata of burials provided archaeologists with a wealth of information. Today, historians have been able to piece together a lot about the Adena despite these limitations. The earthy contents of the mound are largely unknown, though. After years of grave robbers, scientists worry what they missed. 6. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans. The first St. Louis cemetery on this list is arguably the most memorable cemetery. It's a powerful sight to witness. The densely packed cemetery is dotted with rows of above-ground tombs. It is brimming with the mystique and flavor of old New Orleans. There are many ghostly rumors and haunted house tales. Although not the oldest in New Orleans, the cemetery is near. It was first constructed in 1789. And city officials were concerned that current cemeteries wouldn't be able to accommodate all the deceased. So was born St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. The deceased were initially interred underground. However, New Orleans passed a statute requiring all new burials to take place above ground in 1803. The low-lying city has experienced flooding every year since its foundation. A public health nightmare was rapidly emerging from having a lot of human remains wash up. And so the tradition of the raised tombs began. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 has a notable soul inside, just as Old Gravesend in New York City. A Creole mother gave birth to Marie Laveau in 1801 in New Orleans. She was employed as a hairdresser in the town as an adult. However, her side job as a voodoo priestess earned her much greater notoriety in the area. People in New Orleans made great claims about the spell she cast and the mysterious abilities she was said to possess. Marie was a local legend before to her passing in 1881. locals continued to try to win her favor after she was buried in St. Louis Cemetery. For many years later, mourners visited her grave at the cemetery. They would then paint big XS on the tomb door after arriving. Although the city declared the practice to be unlawful, superstition nonetheless persisted. Laveau's legacy endures to this day. Enjoying this list so far? Click the subscribe button to get updates from this video. 5. Providence's North Burial Ground. Around 1700, the North Burial Ground was established in Providence, Rhode Island. Rhode Island saw the arrival of settlers even before America became a country. Planners set aside 45 acres for a cemetery on the north side of the city's historic core. One of the first graves was that of Samuel Whipple, a well-known pioneer. Many more residents joined over the following few years. The North Burial Ground eventually developed as the final resting place for the city's aristocratic citizens and officials. Other cemeteries were combined by Providence throughout the following century. In the past, wealthy households interred their deceased on their own properties. However, as Providence expanded, this practice lost its usefulness. The elite citizens of the city excavated many of their ancestors' and elders' bodies. As a result, in 1785, the North Burial Ground was the new location for all the remains after they had been meticulously removed. Many more eminent citizens were buried at the cemetery throughout the ensuing decades. The cemetery has undergone numerous renovations since then. Additional burial relocations have also become common. The city even temporarily lost a gravestone in the 1980s after an automobile collision ended up in a cemetery corner. Over the years, numerous well-known individuals have been interred there. There are graves for Revolutionary War and Civil War veterans. More recently, notable Americans have their graves there as well, including early goth poet Sarah Helen Whitman and pioneering outdoor woman Annie Smith Peck. And now, the North Burial Ground still welcomes new burials. For a 300-year-old cemetery, that is unusual. However, the website is still live. Every year, it receives roughly 200 sets of remains. Newly departed Providence locals also add their own life stories to the sacred place each year. 4. Charter Street Cemetery in Salem. The implication of Salem is always clear: witchcraft. In the 17th century, the Massachusetts hamlet was infamously thought to be a hub of witchcraft. However, there are more earlier ghost legends in the city. In actuality, the Salem Charter Street Cemetery dates back more than 60 years before the witch trials. The cemetery, often referred to as Old Burying Point by locals, was first referenced in writing in 1637. According to historians today, the context of that reference suggests it existed far earlier. This research therefore shows that Old Burying Point is the earliest European cemetery in America, even though its founding year is unknown. The site's oldest remaining headstone belonged to a woman by the name of Dorothy Cromwell. In 1673, she perished in Salem. It's a miracle that her gravestone has lasted this long. Wood was typically used for early American memorial construction. Therefore, the majority have not endured generations of winter snow, spring rain, and summer sun. It is impossible to tell who else was buried at Old Burying Point before Cromwell. Thankfully, cemetery markers have long since converted to being made of stone for genealogists. However, historians are aware of one thing: Charter Street Cemetery was not the location of the reputed witches' graves in Salem. In 1692, they underwent a close-by trial, and by that time, Old Burying Point had a solid reputation as the city's cemetery. However, people who were found guilty of practicing witchcraft would not have had a public funeral in a prestigious place. They were most likely surreptitiously interred by sympathetic family members. If no one intervened, these alleged witches were buried nearby in unmarked graves. Yes, misty as 3. San Esteban del Rey Mission Church in New Mexico. Spanish explorers traversed the Southwest decades before American colonists began their anti-British uprisings back east. They established the San Esteban del Rey Mission in what is currently western New Mexico in 1629. The Yakima Pueblo people owned the property at the time. The mission was designed by the Spanish to convert the indigenous to Catholicism. The Spanish had aspirations that included the indigenous people adhering to the church's burial practices in the afterlife. The Spanish attempted to convert the Acoma Pueblo to their way of life for many years. Up until the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the visitors had considerable success. Then, during the following 2 decades, the locals seized charge of the mission and mostly put an end to the Spanish invasion. The history of the cemetery there is a tale in and of itself. The location is atop a barren granite mesa with little dirt. There are few agricultural opportunities. Even worse, interment in the ground is virtually difficult. The Spanish found a solution by making the locals haul massive amounts of soil up the rocks to spread on top. It was packed down after the enclosed space was deep enough. The mission would then be a suitable place for Spanish settlers to bury their dead. There are currently 5 of these levels in the cemetery. Some tower 50 feet, 15 meters, over what was once the ground's rough terrain. There are the graves of numerous early settlers and native people. The Acoma people got their way in the end too. Even though the mission is of Catholic origin, locals managed to slip in a few of their traditions over the decades. Today, sculpted faces can be seen inside the cemetery's walls by mission visitors. These are the guards that ensure the safe passage of native souls to the afterlife. The graveyard wall also has a sizable hole in one place. There, it is stated that souls freely depart the location after passing away to begin eternal existence. 2. African Burial Ground in NYC. A little-known cemetery for black inhabitants has existed in New York City for about 200 years. As early as the 1630s, both free and enslaved black individuals were interred there. The ground was active until roughly 1800. The city then stopped utilizing it. It was eventually covered in asphalt and put to new use. It was forgotten for almost 200 years. Later, in 1991, work on a new officer tower along Broadway Avenue started. Mass burials were discovered during ground excavation. The building site unexpectedly changed into a crucial preservation scene. Archaeologists sprang into action and oversaw the project. Additional digging revealed the burial to be larger than 6 acres. Historians named it the African Burial Ground after being horrified by the discovery. There may be graves of notable black people. Juan Rodriguez, the first free black man to settle in Manhattan, who arrived there in 1613, is probably on that list. Historians believe that more than 15,000 people were interred there, based on the size of the area. The earliest generations of slaves who were forcibly brought to America are among the relics. It is now the earliest known African cemetery in the country. Thankfully, by 2003, all the excavated bones were placed in hand-carved coffins and carefully reinterred. 1. The Miles Standish Burial Ground in Massachusetts. The Miles Standish Burial Ground claims to be the country's first kept cemetery. That might be debatable, as we've already seen with some of the questionable dates on this list. However, it is undeniable that this cemetery is very old. It seems to have been founded for the first time in 1638. Additionally significant historically is its position in the Massachusetts city of Duxbury. The location is not far from where the Mayflower initially arrived from England in the early 17th century. The fact that many of the Mayflower's renowned pioneering passengers are buried there shouldn't come as a surprise. He who the cemetery is named for is among the other prominent graves. When military leader Miles Standish passed away close to Duxbury in 1656, he was interred there. The gravestone serves as a permanent memorial to the man who was so important in keeping the pilgrims safe during their early years in America. In fact, his body has now been unearthed again, so that more meaningful monuments can be erected in his honor. The location is home to other historic pilgrim gravestones in addition to Standish. They contain some amazing illustrations used by Puritans in the past. They were all preoccupied with death. And boy, do their tombstone markers reflect that. Modern visitors are confronted by gravestone designs that include disturbing angels, laughing devils, eerie skulls, and sketched coffins. Creepy! What's your creepy cemetery story? Tell us on the comments section down below. This is the Quick List. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.